Hey, Alberta, Mark Dorin. I'm with the Polluter Pay Federation. It's been a wild and crazy week. We're a couple of days away from the writ being dropped on Alberta's 2023 provincial election. And the reason it's been kind of busy and crazy all week is the amount of election promises being floated out by the UCP government prior to dropping the writ. One in particular re-raises things that I've been talking about for quite some time. Going to do a short video on that. Let me share the screen and get right into it. Given my position as vice chair of the Polluter Pay Federation and a longtime land rights advocate, I firmly believe that polluter pay is the only way. This week, we saw a trend towards citizens' pay in sports facilities. The government of Alberta announced that if re-elected, they would contribute money to a new sports facility in Calgary, an arena for the Calgary Flames. We already have quite a bit of commitment from the new Premier Danielle Smith that citizens, instead of oil and gas well licensees, will also be paying for oil and gas well liabilities in the future, which is contrary to current law in Alberta and contrary to the long-standing polluter pay principle that Alberta laws are based on. So let's get into this. Going to talk first about who the main players are in this saga. I put the main players at the top. What we're talking about are corporate handouts, corporate interests that have their hands out to the taxpayers of Alberta. Front and center, number one benefactor, Mr. N. Murray Edwards. He's a shareholder of Canadian Natural Resources Limited. He's also a major shareholder of the group that owns the Calgary Flames, the group that would benefit from provincial money put into a new arena as announced in Calgary this week. There is direct ties to something called RStar. I'm going to try to briefly explain what RStar is in this video, but Mr. Murray Edwards would also be the number one benefactor of RStar in the province of Alberta because his company, Canadian Natural Resources, would also be the number one benefactor of RStar. How did RStar come about? Well, Mr. Reagan Boychuk, who's one of my fellow polluter pay advocates, he's front and center. He came out as lead author with a report called The Big Cleanup, and that triggered something called RStar in response. But the real culprits, the real lawbreakers are Mr. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, and Mr. Seamus O'Regan, who was at the time the Minister of Natural Resources. Reagan Boychuk was one of the leading people at Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project who recommended at the time that the federal government was considering COVID spending and considering throwing money at an inactive well problem that exists in Western Canada, throwing money at that problem. And ALDP strongly recommended that the federal government not do so because it's against the polluter pay principle, but in fact that any money that might be given just be given on a loan basis. So the federal government ignored that, although they did give some loans to the Orphan Well Association. They opened the floodgates of citizen pay by trying to create jobs during COVID-19, and that was a $1.7 billion in inactive well grants offered, $1 billion of which went to the province of Alberta. Canadian Natural Resources was definitely the main benefactor of that money, and of course has operations in Saskatchewan, BC, and Alberta, where they potentially took advantage of that. So the other main players are the RStar lobbyists, which I've shown in a square at the bottom right here. They are led by Mr. Chris Kinnear, who is the president of something, or the lead person in something called Sustaining Alberta's Energy Network, or SANE. RStar lobbyists, they lobbied the Alberta Enterprise Group, who picked up on that lobby. Daniel Smith was the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group at the time. Mr. Shane Sutherland is a major player in this. He starred in an RStar promotional video. And Mr. Pete Guthrie, formerly just an MLA for Airdrie Cochrane riding, became the new Alberta Energy Minister. He advocated for RStar in the legislature before becoming the energy minister, and now that he is the energy minister, pardon me. So those are the main players. Let's move it along. Now, of course, we have something in Canada, and particularly in Alberta, that I'm going to refer to as a relentless, never-ending industry lobby. There's two main lobby groups for the oil and gas industry. The first is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, commonly known as CAP. They represent the big players. It's expensive to be a member of CAP, but CAP has a lot of lobbyists. There's someone from CAP in front of the provincial and federal government almost all the time, let's say. Money talks. Pressure from CAP works. The second lobby group represents the smaller industry players. They call themselves the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, or EPAC. So these groups make up the relentless lobby of industry. More recently, the Narwhal publication came out with a number of stories, one of which was documents reveal how Alberta oil and gas industry used the pandemic to push a wish list. So this is a very revealing article. CAP simply went way too far in lobbying the Alberta government during the pandemic. And this excellent piece by the Narwhal, goes into some freedom of information requests where this is clearly shown. In order to look into the history of RStar and how and when it came to be, at least in recent history, we've got to look back to 2021 and the start of the pandemic. On June 29th, 2021, Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project, or ALDP, led by Dr. David Swan, lead researcher Reagan Boychuk, published a report, and Reagan Boychuk was the lead author on that report. It was called The Big Cleanup: How Enforcing the Polluter Pay Principle Can Unlock Alberta's Next Great Job Boom. This led to Danielle Smith and Chris Kinnear, who were lobbyists for RStar, are now both in government promoting RStar. That led to them asking for a meeting with Dr. Swan and Reagan Boychuk, which occurred. So now it's also clear that that Chris Kinnear of SANE, began lobbying numerous MLAs and raising money for numerous MLAs during the time when the NDP was in government. And so that led to somehow working with the Alberta Enterprise Group when Danielle Smith was the president of that lobby group, and that resulted in a lobby that definitely is recorded in a letter dated July 29th, 2021, when Danielle Smith proposed an RStar pilot to Sonia Savage, the former Alberta Energy Minister and the minister in charge at that time. So there is some question as to whether Jason Kenney was an RStar proponent or not, or still is. And according to Reagan Boychuk, he believes that, strongly believes, and has gone record as saying so, that Danielle Smith told them at the time that they were there at the behest of Premier Jason Kenney. So, but what's clear at this time is that Danielle Smith, despite her lobby to Sonia Savage, everyone at this time to which the Kinnear and Smith were trying to promote the RStar proposal, whether it be Sonia Savage, the energy minister, or the people at ALDP, everyone rejected the RStar proposal because it's clearly contrary to the polluter pay principle, and all the principles of which Alberta energy law have been based on for 3/4 of a century or more in Alberta. So that led to that clear rejection at that time. Now that rejection was clearly documented by former Energy Minister, the Honorable Sonia Savage, in a letter dated June 30, 2021, which I've taken some excerpt from here. Now, this letter was written by the Energy Minister to Mr. David Spears of the Freehold Mineral Owners Association. So there are private individuals that own minerals in Alberta, and they were concerned about RStar. So Ms. Savage wrote the following to that Freehold Mineral Association group in a letter dated June 30th, 2021. She said, and I quote, "The government of Alberta has decided not to accept the RStar proposal. After close consideration, we determined that the proposal does not align with the province's royalty regime or our approach to liability management and upholding the polluter pays principle. The polluter pays principle is a guiding philosophy for liability management in Alberta and is supported by landowners, municipalities, industry associations, investors, environmental groups, and Indigenous communities." So it's very clear that the bottom line at this point in time, which is June of 2021, is that everyone except the federal government, except Chris Kinnear, and except Danielle Smith are for the polluter pay principle and against the RStar proposal. Now, it's very important to note that Canadian Natural Resources is a member of the Alberta Enterprise Group, which is a lobby group registered to make this lobby. And of course, that's who Danielle Smith was working for when she promoted the RStar proposal at this time. A few days later, on July 9th, 2021, Danielle Smith published, the Calgary Herald published an opinion piece by Danielle Smith of the Alberta Enterprise Group, and this opinion piece specifically refers to the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project proposal. That's the big cleanup job report, which I've already shown you, and she refers to it having been made last week or a few days earlier. Her op-ed states that ALD proposal may look sound on paper, but in Danielle Smith's opinion, in practice, it won't work. And she clearly states that a junior energy industry advocacy group calling itself Sustaining Alberta's Energy Network has come up with a better alternative. That better alternative is clearly the RStar proposal. So it's clear that despite the provincial government already having decided it will not accept RStar, Ms. Smith continues to advocate for it. Fast forward a year, and in the summer of 2022, Jason Kenney has stepped aside as leader of the Alberta Party, or intends to step aside, and there is a new campaign underway for replacement leader for the United Conservative Party. Danielle Smith runs for that leadership role. As she is elected, at least she mentions, and I'm talking elected as the UCP leader, she mentions royalty credit for cleanup without talking about RStar by name. And she does this during the election campaign, specifically at the time of the by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat. After she wins the leadership campaign, she mentions it on the eve of winning the UCP leadership race and on the eve of winning that by-election, and she mentions it after being sworn in as premier. Once she is sworn in as premier, she appoints Mr. Pete Guthrie, who advocated previously for RStar as recorded on video in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. The minister triggers a pilot program for RStar, and he starts consultation with landowner groups. Importantly, the assistant deputy minister meets with ALDP. I was a part of that delegation, so I was there. I know exactly what was said in terms of what the some details of the proposed pilot are that are not widely known to the public, and the name of the program is changed. It's now being called the Liability Management Incentive Program, and it's a pilot. So the many details of the pilot program are yet to be determined, but there are some details that are known or that were confirmed in a meeting. So the Liability Incentive Program pilot is limited to $100 million. It is also limited to inactive, contaminated sites that have been inactive for more than 20 years. This particularly that it is targeting contaminated sites was confirmed to ALDP and to me specifically by the Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy. The pilot program clearly ignores Part 5 of the Environmental Protection Enhancement Act, which governs remediation of land that's adversely impacted by spills or releases of harmful substances. And this portion of the act includes the ability to designate contaminated sites as such. So there is a contaminated site designation contemplated by this law. The remedy for a contaminated site or the release of a substance of concern into the atmosphere, a spill of a harmful substance that would contaminate an oil and gas well site, the clear remedy is something called an environmental protection order. And more recently, the Alberta Energy Regulator did issue an environmental protection order to the Curl oil sands mine site releases, for example. So we all know this can be done and should be done to protect the environment. It was not done, and in the past on these sites that have been contaminated for more than 20 years. So it's quite clear that whatever we call this, RStar or the Liability Incentive Program pilot, is patently a reward for thumbing your nose, for operators, well licensees thumbing their nose and for regulators allowing them to do so, thumbing their nose at the laws of Alberta for 2 decades. That's what we're going to reward here. So very importantly, the Premier, in defending this program on radio and in news releases, has repeatedly stated that she wants to continue the site rehabilitation program or something like it, which is in fact the federal COVID-19 funding. It's the program that where the federal government gave grant money contrary to the polluter pay principle to the Western provinces, and Alberta received $1 billion of that, $1.7 billion total. It's also been shown, as I stated, that CNRL has received the vast majority of that funding, certainly more than any other company. I'm not going to get into the details of the liability incentive program pilot, largely because a lot of those details have yet to be determined, but it is clear that it is a credit similar to the RStar credit, which provides that the person that holds the credit gets reduced royalty payments for a specific period of time. So where they might be paying 30 or 40% royalties, for example, those royalties would be reduced down to 5% for some period of time until the costs of cleanup on another site and plugging of another well are recovered. So these credits are earned somehow by closing separate, inactive, contaminated sites. It would appear that these credits may be transferable from one well licensee to another. And it is also very clear already in some of the details published on the pilot program that these credits may apply to wells that are purchased out of the orphanage, so to speak. So if you take a well out of the care and custody of the Orphan Well Association, one can get a royalty incentive for cleaning up those wells, which means that this reduces the amount of closures that are paid for through industry contributions to the orphan fund. So essentially, where industry would pay to retire orphan wells, now we're going to have citizens paying to retire orphan wells. So how this all ties back to Calgary Arenas and Murray Edwards and Canadian Natural Resources, or CNRL, is that CAP members like CNRL, they are the largest contributors to the Orphan Well Fund. This contribution is required by law. CNRL, because it has more well licenses than anyone else, is the single largest contributor to the Orphan Fund, and therefore would be the biggest benefactor if RStar, or the Liability Incentive Program pilot, results in a permanent program. So any money that the Orphan Fund does not spend on closure is money that goes back directly into CAP members' pockets. Well, most in all industry, but mostly CAP members, and particularly CNRL's pocket. So, and it cannot be overlooked that there are direct ties between CNRL and the Alberta Enterprise Group. CNRL is a member of the Alberta Enterprise Group, and there are direct ties between the Alberta Enterprise Group and Danielle Smith. She's the former president and #1 lobbyist for that group, and she's now the premier. And the connections between that group and the current industry minister, Pete Guthrie, are all undeniable ties. So what's the potential cost to Albertans of RStar, or the pilot program, or after the pilot program if it's successful? So the cost has been pegged, presumably because this number was stated in a letter advocating for this pilot program from Danielle Smith as a lobbyist to the former Energy Minister Sonia Savage. The amount was identified as $20 billion, but you know, and now some political parties, and particularly NDP MLAs, have picked up on this figure. It's been pegged at 20 billion, but this number is not accurate, and it's possibly far too low. And the Auditor General more recently found that the internal estimate of the total cleanup cost for all oil and gas wells in Alberta is at $62 billion. So now the ALDP also addressed this. So during the last election campaign, about exactly 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, ALDP held a press conference, invited the leaders of all the political parties, and they explained to the world that they had done a Freedom of Information request, that they had gotten the estimates of cleanup and all the documents that huge amount of documents at the Alberta Energy Regulator on this subject. The Alberta Energy Regulator had not completed its internal work using these numbers, so ALDP did so, and they estimated that it would cost between $40 billion and $70 billion to clean up the oil and gas wells in Alberta. That means to seal them, to remediate the sites. There's not a lot of data on remediation. That's why there's such a big swing in the numbers. There's such a big band between 40 billion and 70 billion, and to reclaim those sites. So that results in an average cleanup cost of a low end of $160,000 per well or per well site, up to a high average of about $279,000 per site. But in reality, we know that many of these contaminated sites could run into tens of millions of dollars. So it's possible that, you know, this pilot program would only clean up a handful of severely contaminated sites. So that's the range of numbers that we're looking at, and that's the potential cost to Alberta of these programs. There's no way to estimate how much it might cost Albertans, but if we were to abandon polluter pay for citizen pay just on wells alone, which doesn't include facilities, which doesn't include oil sands, tailing ponds, or anything to do with oil sands, it could be up to $70 billion. So to conclude, I'm going to respectfully suggest that the federal government opened the door to citizen pay in Alberta, and that door needs to be slammed firmly shut. RStar and the so-called liability management incentive pilot, they're nothing but disguised forms of citizen pay that are contrary to the polluter pay principle. And this was pointed out by the former Energy Minister, Sonia Savage, in rejecting the RStar proposal in June of 2021. Despite this being contrary to law, Daniel Smith and Pete Guthrie would continue citizen pay by way of the pilot program, and it's clear that there's really nothing to try out here. There's nothing to be measured or gained from measuring whether or not this pilot would somehow work. The industry knows, and I suggest virtually everyone knows, how to close wells, how to seal them, cement them, cut the casing off below surface, how to remediate contaminated sites, and how to reclaim well and facility sites, which simply means, you know, removing the surface facilities that are put there, digging out any gravel, replacing it back with topsoil, seeding those sites back to, or putting them back to their original use, which might be agricultural use or industrial use, or even making them ready for residential use in some parts of Alberta. Ultimately, because polluter pay is the only way, Polluter Pay Federation takes the position that citizens must ensure that Daniel Smith and Pete Guthrie do not form or make up any part of the provincial government in the 2023 election. We suggest that citizens need to send a message that MLAs represent citizens. They should not be representing corrupt corporate interests who hire lobbyists or to help these corrupt corporate interests gain political power. Remember, polluter pay is the only way. Thanks for listening.